The smell of dust, sweat, and old leather filled the air as Jack Calloway walked through the crowded livestock auction, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He wasn't here to buy. He wasn't even sure why he had come. Maybe it was just something to do, something to pull him out of his own head for a few hours. Civilian life had been a constant battle ever since he left the Marines, and most days he felt like he was fighting an enemy that had no face, no shape, just a weight that sat in his chest, suffocating him. He stood near the back, barely listening as horses were paraded onto the platform, their stats read out in the auctioneer's rapid-fire chant. Strong stallions, well-groomed mares, each one fetching thousands of dollars, owners boasting about their lineage, their endurance, their worth. But then, the energy of the auction shifted. The next horse was led out, stumbling slightly as she stepped onto the stage. She was thin, pitifully so, her ribs pressing through a dull, matted coat. Her legs wobbled, barely strong enough to hold her weight. Her eyes, once the fire of a wild horse, were dull, sunken. The auctioneer sighed, his voice losing its practiced enthusiasm. "All right, folks, next up, this is a 7-year-old mare, no papers, no record. Owner surrendered her." A pause. "Let's start the bidding at $500. Silence. Jack shifted, watching as the mare took a shaky step forward, her ears flicking back at the unfamiliar voices. No one raised their hand. "All right, $400. A man near the front snorted. "That thing ain't worth a dime. Might as well send her straight to slaughter." Laughter rippled through the room. Jack clenched his jaw. $300? Nothing. The auctioneer sighed, already moving to dismiss her. "All right, let's—" Jack raised his hand. The entire auction house turned to stare. Whispers spread through the crowd. "You serious?" someone muttered. Jack met the auctioneer's gaze. $300. His voice was calm, steady, but his hands trembled in his pockets. The hammer slammed onto the wooden podium. "Sold!" More laughter followed as Jack walked up to claim the horse. He heard the murmurs. "That guy just wasted his money. She won't last a week. Dumbass must have a death wish." Jack ignored them. He approached the mare slowly, his heart hammering. Up close, she looked even worse. Scars along her back, her hooves cracked and brittle. But there was something in her eyes, something that made his breath hitch. She wasn't just dying, she was waiting for someone to tell her she was worth saving. He reached out, pressing his palm against her nose. She didn't flinch. "You're coming home with me," he whispered. The mare blinked, shifting her weight slightly toward him. Maybe she understood, maybe she didn't. But Jack had just made the biggest gamble of his life. And deep down, he knew. He wasn't just saving her. He was saving himself, too. The first night was hell. Jack had barely gotten the mare, whom he'd decided to name Grace, out of the trailer before her legs buckled beneath her. She crumpled into the straw-covered floor of the stall, her breathing ragged. He dropped to his knees beside her, panic creeping up his spine. "Come on, girl," he murmured, running a hand down her thin neck. She was burning up. He had seen this look before, on the battlefield. Soldiers bleeding out, the light already fading from their eyes. Bodies giving up before the fight had even begun. Jack threw a blanket over her and sprinted to grab his phone. When the vet arrived, her face was grim. "She's worse than I thought." Jack refused to hear it. "What do I do?" His voice was sharp, urgent. He hadn't saved her from slaughter just for her to die on his watch. The vet sighed. "Fluids, rest, food, slowly. But listen, Jack." She hesitated. "It might be kinder to put her down." Jack's fist clenched. "No," he said simply. The vet exhaled but didn't argue. "Then be ready to fight for her." And fight he did. The next few days were exhausting. Jack stayed up with Grace, kneeling beside her in the straw, forcing her to drink water when she refused. He brought her food every few hours, even when she only nibbled at it. He stayed up until his own body ached, keeping the barn heater on through the freezing nights. When he wasn't tending to her, he was outside, fixing the old fences and clearing the field where she would, one day, run again. Every morning, Jack sat beside her and talked. "Grace, I know what it's like to be broken," he murmured, resting his arms on his knees. "I know what it's like to feel like you're done." The wind howled outside. Grace's ears flicked. Jack swallowed, his throat tight. "I had a buddy overseas," he said. "Took a hit. We were pinned down, no way to get him out. He looked at me and said, 'Go.'" Jack exhaled sharply. "And I did. I left him there, and when I came back, he was gone." Silence. Jack ran a shaking hand through his hair. "I know I can't fix the past, but maybe I can fix this." The next morning, Grace stood. Jack jolted awake to the sound of shifting straw. Grace was up, wobbly, shaking, but standing. Jack felt something crack open inside him, something raw and painful. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. Weeks passed. Grace gained strength. Her ribs weren't as visible. Her legs steadied. She followed Jack around the barn, nudging his shoulder, waiting for treats. The town noticed. Old ranchers leaned over their fences, watching Jack walk her through the field. Some scoffed, shaking their heads. "You're wasting time, Calloway," one muttered. Jack just smirked. "Watch me." And they did. Until one day Grace, who once couldn't even stand, broke into a full gallop. Jack watched, breathless as she ran, her coat gleaming, her muscles rippling beneath the sun. The entire town saw it. And no one laughed anymore. Jack stood by the fence watching Grace run. Not just run, fly. Her hooves barely touched the ground as she galloped across the open field, her mane flowing like a banner of defiance. The same horse everyone said was worthless, broken beyond saving, was now the strongest creature he had ever seen. A crowd had gathered outside the fence, people who had mocked him at the auction, people who had shaken their heads, who had told him to give up. Ranchers, neighbors, even strangers who had heard the rumors. They had come to see if the impossible was real, and Grace made them believe. Jack felt his throat tighten. He had spent months fighting for her, pushing through exhaustion, ignoring the voices that told him it was useless. And now, here she was. Someone murmured behind him, "Jesus, I can't believe it." Another voice, softer, "That ain't the same horse. It just can't be." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "It's her," he muttered. "She just needed someone to believe in her." Suddenly, a sharp whistle rang out. Jack turned. The auctioneer from that day. The same man who had nearly sent Grace to the slaughterhouse stepped forward, his arms crossed. "I'll be damned," he muttered, watching her move. "Didn't think she had it in her." Jack's jaw tightened. "She always did," he said. "You just didn't look close enough." That night, Jack sat on the porch, a cold beer in hand. Grace was resting peacefully in the barn. He should have felt victorious, should have felt like the fight was finally over. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Because Grace wasn't just a horse anymore. She was a symbol. People had seen what she could do, and now they wanted more. The next morning, a man in a suit arrived at Jack's doorstep, some hotshot from a racing stable. "She's impressive," the man admitted. "We're prepared to make an offer." Jack's stomach turned. An offer. Money, recognition, fame, and the chance to let Grace prove herself on a grand stage. But at what cost? That night, Jack went to the barn. He found Grace standing there, watching him with those knowing eyes. "What do you think, girl?" he murmured. Grace snorted, nudging his shoulder. Jack exhaled. She didn't care about fame. She just wanted to run, to live. And that's when Jack made his decision. The next day, the town gathered, expecting an announcement. Jack stepped forward, his voice steady. "I ain't selling her," he said. Silence. Someone gasped. "You're turning down the offer?" Jack nodded. "She doesn't need a racetrack to prove anything. She already won." The ranchers muttered, stunned. Some called him crazy. Others looked at Grace, standing tall beside Jack, her head high, her spirit unbroken. And for the first time, no one doubted him. Months later, Jack watched Grace run through the fields, free. He had come to that auction looking for a reason to keep going, and Grace had given him one. She had saved him just as much as he had saved her. The broken ones always found each other, and sometimes they healed together. The end.